The Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Nigerian-Biafra War, was a 3-year bloody conflict with a death toll numbering more than 1 million people. Having commenced 7 years after Nigeria gained independence from Britain, the war began with the secession of the southeastern region of the nation on May 30, 1967, when it declared its independent Republic of Biafra. The ensuing battles and well-publicized human suffering prompted international outrage and intervention. But what led to this conflict that claimed a lot of lives? Why did Biafra go to war with Nigeria? Hi guys, welcome to Afriverse Historic. On today's episode, look at the reason why Biafra went to war with Nigeria on May 30, 1967. But first, let's take a step back and understand the cultural dynamics among the tribes in colonial Nigeria and post-independence. Do stay tuned and enjoy the ride. The origins of the Civil War can be connected to the colonial amalgamation in 1914 of the British Northern Protectorate Lagos Colony and the Southern Nigerian Protectorate, which was intended for better administration due to the proximity of these protectorates. However, the change did not take into consideration the differences in culture and religions of the people in each area. Competition for political and economic power exacerbated tensions. Nigeria gained independence from the United Kingdom on 1st October 1960 with a population of 45.2 million, made up of more than 300 different ethnic and cultural groups. When the colony of Nigeria was created, its 3 largest ethnic groups were the Igbo, who formed 60 to 70% of the population in the southeast, the Hausa Fulani of the Sokoto Caliphate, who formed more than 67% of the population in the northern part of the territory, the Yoruba, who formed about 75% of the population in the southwest. Although these groups had their homelands, by the 1960s, the people were dispersed across Nigeria with all 3 ethnic groups represented substantially in major cities. When the war broke out in 1967, there were still 5,000 Igbos in Lagos. The semi-feudal and Muslim Hausa Fulani in the north were traditionally ruled by a conservative Islamic hierarchy consisting of emirs, who in turn owned their ultimate allegiance to the Sultan of Sokoto, whom they had regarded as the source of all political power and religious authority. Apart from the Hausa Fulani, the Kanuri were another dominant majority Muslim ethnic group that had key figures in the war. They made up about 5% of Nigeria's population and were the dominant ethnic group in the northeast. They historically successfully resisted the Sokoto Caliphate during the 19th century throughout their millennium-long Kanem-Borno Empire. The southernmost part of the region, known as the Middle Belt, had large Christian and animalist population. Through missionary activities, the nodalization policy of the regional government, the sub-region had a significant Eurocentric educated population. Several key figures on the Nigerian side of the war came from the sub-region, such as Yakubu Gowon, Theophilus Danjuma, both of whom were Christians. The Yoruba political system in the southwest, like that of the Hausa Fulani, also consisted of a series of monarchs, the Obas. The Yoruba monarchs, however, were less autocratic than those in the north. The political and social systems of the Yoruba, accordingly, allowed for greater upward mobility based on acquired rather than inherited wealth and title. In contrast to the 2 other groups, Igbos in the southeast lived in autonomous, democratically organized communities. Unlike the 2 regions, decisions within Igbo communities were made by a General Assembly, in which men and women participated. The differing political systems and structures reflected and produces divergent customs and values. The Hausa Fulani commoners, having contact with political systems only through a village head designated by the emir or one of his subordinates, did not view political leaders as amenable to influence. Political decisions were to be submitted to. With as many other authoritarian religious and political systems, leadership positions were given to persons willing to be subservient and loyal to superiors. A chief function of this political system in this context was to maintain conservative values, which caused many Hausa Fulani to view economic and social innovation as subversive or sacrilegious. In contrast to the Hausa Fulani, the Igbos and other Biafrans often participated directly in the decisions which affected their lives. They had a lively awareness of the political system and regarded it as an instrument for achieving their personal goals. Status was acquired through the ability to arbitrate disputes that might arise in the village, and through acquiring rather than inherited wealth. The Igbo had been substantially victimized in the Atlantic slave trade in the year 1790. It was reported that 20,000 people sold every year from Boni. 16,000 were Igbo. With their emphasis upon social achievement and political participation, the Igbo adapted to the challenge of colonial rule in innovative ways. This tradition derived differences that perpetuated and perhaps enhanced the colonial government in Nigeria. In the north, the colonial government found it convenient to rule indirectly through the emirs, thus perpetuating rather than changing the indigenous authoritarian political system. Christian missionaries were excluded from the north. The area thus remained virtually closed to European cultural influence. By contrast, the richest of the Igbo often sent their sons to British universities with the intention of preparing them to work with the British. During the ensuing years, the northern emirs maintained their traditional political and religious institutions while reinforcing their social structure. At the time of independence in 1960, the north was by far the most underdeveloped area in Nigeria. It had an English literacy rate of 2% as compared to the 19.2% in the east. Literacy in Almajiri local languages in Arabic script, learned in connection with religious education, was much higher. The West also enjoyed a much higher literacy level, as it was the first part of the country to have contact with Western education and established a free primary education program under the pre-independence Western regional government. If you find this video worthwhile, please take out some time to smash a like and subscribe to the channel, as it goes a long way in supporting our efforts. Thank you. Now let's get back to the video. In the West, the missionaries rapidly introduced Western forms of education. Consequently, the Yoruba were the first in Nigeria to adopt Western bureaucratic social norms. They made up the first classes of African civil servants, doctors, lawyers, and other technicians and professionals. Missionaries were introduced at later dates in eastern areas because the British experienced difficulty establishing firm control over the highly autonomous communities there. However, the Igbo and other Biafran people actively embraced Western education, and they overwhelmingly came to adopt Christianity. Population pressure in the Igbo homeland, combined with aspirations of monetary wage, drove thousands of Igbos to other parts of Nigeria in search of work. By the 1960s, Igbo political culture was more unified and the region relatively prosperous, with tradesmen and literate elites active not just in traditional Igbo East, but throughout Nigeria. By 1966, the traditional ethnic and religious differences between Northerners and the Igbo were exacerbated by new differences in educational and economic class. Nigeria became an independent country on October 1, 1960. Abubakar Tafawa Balewa was his first federal prime minister. He had held the position since 1957, and Nnamdi Azikiwe became its president of the Senate, which was a largely ceremonial role. Following the United Nations supervised referendum in 1961, the northern part of the Trust Territory of the Cameroons joined Nigeria's northern region, while in October, the southern Cameroons united with Cameroon to form the Federal Republic of Cameroon. On October 1, 1963, Nigeria became a republic, with Azikiwe as its president, although, as prime minister, Balewa remained more politically powerful. In Nigeria and its surrounding region, long-standing regional stresses, ethnic competitiveness, educational inequality, and economic imbalance being the most prominent, again came to the fore in a controversial census between 1962-63. In an attempt to stave off ethnic conflict, Nigeria's Midwest region was created in 1963 by dividing the Western region. Despite this division, the country was still segmented into three large geographic regions, each of which was essentially controlled by an ethnic group: the West by the Yoruba people, the East by the Igbo people, and the North by the Hausa Fulani people. Conflicts were endemic as regional leaders protected their privileges. The South complained of Northern domination, and the North feared that the Southern elite was bent on capturing power. In the West, the government had fallen apart in 1962, and the boycott of the federal election of December 1964 brought Nigeria to the brink of breakdown. The point of no return was reached on January 1966, when after the collapse of the Order of the West following the fraudulent election of October 1965, a group of army officers attempted to overthrow the federal government, and Balewa and two of the regional premiers were murdered. The military administration was set up under Major General Johnson Abi Ironsi, but his plan to abolish the regions and impose a unitary government met with anti-Igbo riots in the north. The military intervention worsened the political situation as the military itself split along ethnic lines. Its officers clashed over power, and the instigators and leaders of the January coup were accused of favoring Igbo domination. In July 1966, northern officers staged a counter-coup. Agi Ironsi was assassinated. The Lieutenant Colonel, later General Yakubu Gowon, came to power. The crisis was compounded by internal communal clashes in the north and threats of secession in the south. After the January coup, Igbos in the north were accused of taxing their hosts on the loss of their leaders. These provocations were so pervasive that they warranted the promulgation of Decree 44 of 1966, banning them by the military government. The first president of Nigeria, Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was away during the first coup, noted, Igbo elements who were domiciled in northern Nigeria taunted northerners by defaming their leaders through means of records or songs or pictures. They also published pamphlets and postcards which displayed a peculiar representation of certain northerners, living or dead, in a manner likely to provoke disaffection. From June through October 1966, pogroms in the north killed an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 Igbo, half of them children, and caused more than 1 million or 2 million to flee to the eastern region. 29 September 1966 became known as Black Thursday. It was considered the worst day of the massacres. Ethnomusicologist Charles Kiel, who was visiting Nigeria in 1966, recounted, the pogroms I witnessed in Makurdi, Nigeria, in late September 1966 were foreshadowed by months of intensive anti-Igbo and anti-Eastern conversations among Tiv, Idoma, Hausa, and other northerners resident in Makurdi, and fitting a pattern replicated in the city after city. The massacres were led by the Nigerian army. Before, during, and after the slaughter, Colonel Gowon could be heard over the radio issuing guarantees of safety to all Easterners, all citizens of Nigeria, but the intent of the soldiers, the only power that counts in Nigeria now and then, was painfully clear. After counting the disemboweled bodies along the Makurdi road, I was escorted back to the city by the soldiers, who apologized for the stench and explained politely that they were doing me and the world a great favor by eliminating the Igbos. The deluge of refugees in the eastern Nigeria created a difficult situation. Extensive negotiations took place between Ojukwu, representing Eastern Nigeria, and Gowon, representing Nigerian Federal Military Government. In the Aburi Accord, finally signed at Aburi, Ghana, the parties agreed that a looser Nigerian Federation would be implemented. Gowon delayed the announcement of the agreement and eventually reneged. On 27 May 1967, Gowon proclaimed the division of Nigeria into 12 states. This decree carved the eastern region into 3 parts: Southeastern States, River States, and East Central States. Now the Igbos, concentrated in East Central, would lose control over most of the petroleum located in the other 2 areas. On 30 May 1967, Ojukwu declared independence and renamed the entire eastern region the Republic of Biafra. The federal military government immediately placed an embargo on all shipping to and from Biafra, but not on oil tankers. Biafra quickly moved to collect oil royalties from oil companies doing business within its borders. When Shell BP acquiesced to this request at the end of June, the federal government extended its blockade to include oil. The blockade, which most foreign actors accepted, played a decisive role in putting Biafra at a disadvantage from the beginning of the war. Although the very young nation had a chronic shortage of weapons to go to war, it was determined to defend itself. Although there was much sympathy in Europe and elsewhere, only 5 countries, Tanzania, Gabon, Ivory Coast, Zambia, and Haiti, officially recognized the Euro Republic. The United Kingdom, supplying heavy weapons and ammunition to the Nigerian side, officially to preserve the multi-ethnic country it had created, but also to preserve the supply of Nigerian oil to the United Kingdom and to protect the investments of Shell BP. The Biafran side received arms and ammunition from France, even though the French government denied sponsoring Biafra. An article in the Paris Match of 20th November 1968 claimed that French arms were reaching Biafra through neighboring countries such as Gabon. The heavy supply of weapons by the United Kingdom was the biggest factor to determine the outcome of the war. Several peace accords were held, with most of the notable one held at Aburi, Ghana, the Aburi Accord. There were different accounts of what took place in Aburi. Ojukwu accused the federal government on going back on their promises, while the federal government accused Ojukwu of distortion and half-truths. Ojukwu gained agreement of a confederation for Nigeria rather than a federation. He was warned by his advisors that Gowon did not understand the difference and would renege upon his agreements. When this happened, Ojukwu regarded it as both a failure by Gowon to keep to the spirit of the Aburi Agreement and the lack of integrity on the side of the Nigerian military government in the negotiations towards a united Nigeria. Gowon's advisors, to the contrary, felt that he had enacted as much as was politically feasible in fulfillment of the spirit of Aburi. The eastern region was very ill-equipped for the war, outmanned and outgunned by the Nigerians, but had the advantages of fighting in their homeland, support of most Easterners, determination, and the use of limited resources. The United Kingdom, which maintained the highest level of influence over Nigeria's highly valued oil industry through Shell BP, and the Soviet Union, supported the Nigerian government, especially by military supplies. The Nigerian army in 1967 was completely unready for the war. The Nigerian army had no training or experience of war on the operational level, still being primarily an internal security force. Most Nigerian officers were more concerned with their social lives than the military training, spending a disproportionate amount of their time on partying, drinking, hunting, and playing games. Social status in the Nigerian army was extremely important, and officers devoted an excessive amount of time to ensure their uniforms were always immaculate. while there was a competition to own the most expensive automobiles and homes. The killings and purges perpetrated during the two coups of 1966 had killed most of the Sandhurst graduates. By July 1966, all the graduates holding the rank above colonel had either been killed or discharged, while only 5 officers holding the rank of lieutenant colonel were still alive and on duty. Almost all the junior officers had received their commission after 1960, and most were heavily dependent on the more experienced NCOs to provide necessary leadership. The same problems that afflicted the Federal Army also affected the Biafran Army even more, whose officer corps was based around former Federal Igbo officers. The shortage of experienced officers was a major problem for the Biafran Army, made worse by a climate of paranoia and suspicion within Biafra, as Ojukwu believed that other former federal officers were plotting against him. In May, the Eastern Regions Consultative Assembly authorized Ojukwu to establish a sovereign republic, while at the same time, the federal military government promulgated a decree dividing the 4 regions into 12 states, including 6 in the north, 3 in the east, in an attempt to break the power of the regions. On May 30, 1967, Ojukwu declared secession, and the 3 states of the eastern region, under the name of Republic of Biafra, which Nigeria's federal government interpreted as an act of rebellion. Fighting broke out in early July. Within weeks, the conflict had escalated into a full-scale civil war. In August 1967, Biafran troops crossed the Niger, seized Benin City, and were well on their way to Lagos before they were checked at Ore, a small town in the western state, now Ondo State. Shortly after, federal troops entered Enugu, the provisional capital of Biafra, and penetrated the Igbo heartland. The next 2 years were marked by stiff resistance in the shrinking Biafra enclave and by heavy casualties among civilians as well as in both armies, all set within what threatened to be a military stalemate. Peacemaking attempts by the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, the Pope, and others were ineffective, and Biafra began gaining recognition from African states, Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon, Tanzania, and Zambia. France provided weapons to Biafra after the UK and Soviet Union sent arms to the federal government. Biafra also received aid from international organizations for its population, which was suffering from starvation. The final Biafran collapse began on December 24, 1969, launched a significant offensive. Biafra was short on ammunition, and its people were desperate for food, and its leaders controlled only 1/6 of the territory that had formed the Biafran Republic in 1967. Ojukwu fled to Côte d'Ivoire on January 11, 1970, and the Biafran deputation formally surrendered in Lagos 4 days later. The Republic of Biafra had come to an end. Estimates of the number of people who died during the Nigerian Civil War vary significantly, from 500,000 to 3 million. Causes include battlefield deaths, ethnic cleansing, and starvation. In the beginning of this video, I asked why Biafra went to war. It is believed that it was because of the will to survive by the Igbo race, as they were backed in a corner and had nowhere else to turn to. We only hope that the new generation of Nigerians learn from this tragic history. Thanks for watching the video, guys. I would really love to know your thoughts about why the war broke out on May 30th, 1967. Do you think there are alternatives on how to solve the crisis rather than going to war? Please let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Don't forget to smash a like and subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification button to get more content like this about African history. It's been Nando from Afriverse Historic. See you in the next one.